President. Over the weekend, I was reflecting on the times that our nation finds itself in today. We are witnessing the rebirth of a new civil rights movement when it comes to reforming our police departments. Americans now know the names of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Freddie Gray, and so many others. The current protests we've seen throughout the nation and throughout the world are a direct result of an incredible leap in technology, where individual citizens and officers themselves can record interactions between police officers and members of the community in real time. Madam President, but for these troubling interactions between the police and the citizens that are sworn to protect or serve, we saw it on video. It's not new, but we now have the evidence. They just happened to be caught, creating stronger legal evidence of misconduct and abuse. Today, as our nation experiences yet another civil rights movement, this time during a pandemic, I want to share with my colleagues some words of inspiration I often turn to in times of trouble. First is the Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, the first mentioned in the Constitution. So let us think how we as the United States can help to establish justice, as we are exhorted to do by the Constitution, which we are sworn to uphold and defend. The second set of words I would like to share with you are from my colleague and dear friend, the late Elijah Cummings, who represented Baltimore in the Congress for many years. Representative Cummings gave the eulogy for Freddie Gray in 2015, who died after being arrested and taken into police custody. During Freddie Gray's church service, Elijah closed with the quote from the Old Testament book of Amos. I want justice, oceans of it. I want fairness, rivers of it. That's what I want. That's all I want. The third story I want to share with my colleagues is the inspiration I felt from reading Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail in April of 1963. Dr. King wrote, "We know through painful experiences that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well-timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I've heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see, we won with one of our distinguished jurists, that justice too long delayed is justice denied. We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional God-given rights. Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will, drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of 20 million Negro brothers smothering in the airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who is asking, Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean? When you are hurried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro living constantly at tiptoe stance, never quite knowing what to expect next, and are plagued with the inner fears and outer resentments, when you are forever fighting on denigrating sense of nobodiness, that you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over and men are no longer willing to plunge into the abyss of despair. I hope, sirs, you understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience. So this weekend, as I was thinking about our charge to establish justice in the Constitution and the pleas from Elijah Cummings and Dr. King, I contemplated where we are today. We're at a point in our nation that we need to make transformational change when it comes to our police officers and their fundamental relationships with our communities, in particular the African American community and communities of color. We can no longer wait. We must make bold changes now. So, Madam President, I agree with Leader Schumer and Senators Booker and Harris, who are the authors of the Justice and Policing Act, My concern is that the legislation authored by Senator Scott, the Justice Act, falls dangerously short for what we need for comprehensive, effective, and transformational police reform that our country and the American people are demanding. I therefore hope that Leader McConnell will negotiate with Leader Schumer so that we can work on a bipartisan bill and establish a constructive starting point on policing reform. I listened to the debate with Senator Scott and Senator Kaine, and I've seen this before. When you bring a partisan bill to the floor where there's no pre-arranged opportunity to offer the types of amendments with simple majority votes so the rule of the Senate can prevail, when you start from a point that cannot lead to a successful conclusion, you shouldn't start. You should go back to negotiate a truly bipartisan bill. We should use the model of the CARES Act legislation that was signed into law in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. That was a bipartisan bill that ultimately was brought to the fore. Let me just highlight a few of my concerns with the Justice Act. This legislation does not contain any mechanism to hold law enforcement officers accountable in court for their misconduct. For example, it makes no changes in law when it comes to qualified immunity or criminal intent standards for law enforcement. Current legal standards have allowed law enforcement officers regularly to evade criminal liability for excessive use of force and have shielded officers from liability even when they violate citizens' constitutional rights. The Justice Act does not implement a public national misconduct registry necessary to ensure communities have information necessary to hold their law enforcement officers accountable. The Justice Act fails to establish the collection of all use of force data and data related to religious and racial profiling, and it does nothing to end harmful policing practices like racial and religious profiling. By contrast, the Justice and Policing Act offered by Senators Booker and Harris does contain legislation I authored, the End Racial and Religious Profiling Act. Why do we need that? Studies have shown that blacks are 3.6 times more likely to be arrested for selling drugs, despite the fact that whites are more likely to sell drugs. Studies show that blacks are 2.5 times more likely to be arrested for possessing drugs, despite using drugs at the same rates as whites. This is just wrong. And Congress and even President Trump recognized this when we made some modest improvements with the First Step Act. That was a bipartisan bill and started as a bipartisan bill, and we were able to get it enacted. The End Racial and Religious Profiling Act is designed to enforce the constitutional rights to equal protection under law by eliminating racial and religious-based discriminatory profiling at all levels of law enforcement by changing the policies and procedures. It allows police to focus their work more accurately rather than wasting resources on blanket stereotypes. It requires enhanced data collection from the Department of Justice to track and monitor discriminatory profiling. It holds state and local enforcement agencies accountable by conditioning federal funds on the adoption of policies and best practices to combat profiling by officers. It eliminates once and for all discriminatory profiling. It's in the Booker-Harris bill. It's not in the Scott bill. The underlying Justice Act does not include any real national standards for law enforcement. By contrast, the Justice and Policing Act contains legislation I authored, the Law Enforcement Trust and Integrity Act, which takes a comprehensive approach on how local police organizations can adopt performance-based standards to ensure that instances of misconduct will be minimized through training and oversight. That legislation takes steps to mitigate police violence by designating resources for community development and the transformation of public safety practices. In Baltimore, we have an ongoing federal partnership with city law enforcement and the federal Justice Department following the tragic death of Freddie Gray Jr. This is an example of continued efforts to rebuild trust between communities and police and encourage the establishment of more effective police models. The legislation I described provides public safety innovation grants to help communities reimagine and develop concrete, just, and equitable public safety approaches. This is in the Booker-Harris bill. It's not in the Scott bill. The Justice Act does not adequately address the issue of no-knock warrants in drug cases, nor does it adequately address the use of chokeholds. Finally, legislation does not address the issue of establishing a national use of force standard. By contrast, the Justice and Policing Act changes the use of force standards for officers so that deadly force be used only as a last resort while requiring officers to employ de-escalation techniques. Let me bring to my colleagues' attention a letter dated June 23rd, 2020, from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. In that letter, that conference writes Congress, "We write to express our strong opposition to S. 3985, the Justice Act. The Justice Act is inadequate response to the decades of pain, hardship, and devastation that Black people have and continue to endure as a result of systemic racism and lax policies that fail to hold police accountable for misconduct." The letter goes on to say abusive policing practices coupled with devastating state-sanctioned violence have exacted systemic brutality and fatality upon Black people since the nation's founding. Police have shot and killed more than 1,000 people in the United States over the past year, and Black people are disproportionately more likely than white to be killed by police. The current protests in our cities are a response not only to the unjust policing of Black people, but also calls for action to public officials to be bold, comprehensive, and structural changes. The letter concludes, passing watered-down legislation that fails to remedy the actual harms resulting in the loss of life is a moral statement that is inconsistent with a genuine belief that Black lives matter. Anything less than full support for comprehensive legislation that holds police accountable is inexcusable. So, Madam President, let me close my remarks once again by sharing some words from Dr. King from the March on Washington in 1963. In his famous speech at the foot of the Lincoln Memorial at the National Mall in Washington, D.C., Dr. King said, "In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, Black men as well as white, would be guaranteed the unalienable right of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we come to cash this check, a check that will give us, upon demand, the riches of freedom and the security of justice." Dr. King continued by saying, "We have also come to this hollow spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or taking a tranquilizer drug of graduation. Now is the time to make real the promise of democracy. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment." Madam President, the House of Representatives is scheduled to pass their version of the Justice and Policing Act on Thursday. Let us take up meaningful legislation in the Senate as the base bill negotiated between Democrats and Republicans. Let us rise to the occasion and make the founders of this nation proud. With that, Madam President, I would suggest the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.